Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast, which is sponsored by the Timeline app. Timeline is a retirement income planning software that helps financial planners like me bring your retirement journey to life and answer your big retirement income questions. I am delighted today to be joined by advertising legend and vice chairman of Ogilvy in the UK, Rory Sutherland. He's got a degree in classics from Cambridge University, a sharp mind and a quick wit. And Rory is an expert in behavioural economics and consumer behaviour. He's published 2 books, writes regular columns for publications including The Spectator, and his TED Talks have been viewed nearly 7 million times. A very warm welcome to the podcast, Rory.
It's a great pleasure to be on. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Rory, some people may not know you, and they may not know who Ogilvy are, I suppose, our retired audience. So could you give me a little bit of kind of background of how you've ended up where you end up?
Yes, Ogilvy is part of WPP, which is the kind of largest marketing services business in the world. Ogilvy was founded in, I think, 1948 by David Ogilvy. As the New York outpost of a British advertising agency, which then went on to become so successful in New York that the American entity ended up effectively buying the British one that had founded it in a kind of reverse takeover of sorts.
Right.
And I joined as a graduate trainee in 1988, pretty much straight out of university, and I've been there for 30 years since. I had the advantage of starting in a field of advertising called direct marketing, which would be, back in the 80s, it would have been off-the-page sales, some telephone marketing, direct mail marketing. And the interesting thing about direct marketing, of course, is you get very direct results. You can test 2 or 3 different approaches, creative approaches, and measure if... Those of you of a nostalgic bent may remember clipping something called a coupon in the newspaper, putting it in an envelope with your name and address, possibly even a credit card number, and posting it off. Somewhere on that coupon was a code, which might have said JEF/109E, which was specific to both the medium in which it appeared and the creative execution. And so you could test, by the way, 2 creative executions in the same newspaper. That's because newspapers are printed in parallel on 2 or 4 presses. And you could actually run different advertisements, different messages, effectively. And what then happens after they're printed is they're all jumbled up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's not as if, all of one creative execution will go to the north and all of another will go to the south. They're basically evenly spread, which allows you to test how effective a particular advertisement might be, at the very least, at garnering direct sales or inquiries. And the code would therefore inform where you advertised next and what you said. Right. Just to give the advertising industry a bit of credit, that's known as a randomized control trial. The advertising industry started doing them in 1880, 1890. Medicine didn't really catch on until about the 1940s or 50s.
Wow.
So this was a case where the advertising industry was weirdly ahead of medical science by about a generation. In fairness to medical science, there were ethical concerns, of course, in testing random things, because the Hippocratic Oath would mean that you arguably had to give everybody what you believed at the time to be the best shot.
Yeah.
But what this revealed, just as randomized controlled trials in medicine reveal what's actually an effective drug and what's merely a placebo effect, in advertising it would repeatedly reveal things which essentially meant that using mainstream economic logic as a way to predict what would work was a very fast way of going bankrupt. Because repeatedly you found elements of consumer behavior which completely defied conventional logic. And I mean, there were famous examples of this. There was a famous test, I think, for an American version of what might have been Mothercare, where they tested 3 offers if you spend a certain amount of money in the shop in the first so many months, you could receive, and they tested 3 prizes, a cuddly bear. The cuddly bear, bear in mind, is worth about at the time was worth about $3. A $25 voucher, or a cuddly bear plus the $25 voucher. Okay, the cuddly bear on its own did best. We continue to find things like this, which mean that if you're in a board meeting or you're in a meeting discussing a particular course of action, our natural instinct is always to suggest the most logical thing, because in a business setting, we like to appear logical to our colleagues. And our contention is this is actually a very dangerous thing indeed, because what appears to be logical and sensible and what gets everybody nodding happily, we've obeyed the basic constraints of logic here, so I think we can all pat ourselves on the back and say we've done a good job. Those decisions can be weirdly dangerous. The most recent one we had, equivalent to the cuddly bear incident, was a charity door drop where mentioning gift aid on the envelope, which is where you basically tick a box and give some tax details, and that means the government effectively gives the taxed portion of your donation in addition to your donation. So you can actually increase your donation by 25% or more, depending on the rate of tax you pay, for free. Mentioning that massively reduced donations. It not only reduced the amount of donations, you might argue that's logical, because if you think the government's topping it up, well, I don't need to give quite so much. But it also reduced the number of people giving. And now, that's completely contrary to conventional logic. It's also interesting because it's also, I think, contrary not only to what a board of directors would say, it's contrary to what consumers themselves would say. You know, if you went to a bunch of consumers and said, and if for every pound you gave, the government was to give a further 25 pence, would that make you more likely to give? And everyone would go, oh yes. You wouldn't get many people going, nah. Okay. So it's not only a question that by being logical we misunderstand consumers. I think we have to face up to a more, a slightly more disturbing thing, which is that people themselves don't really understand what they instinctively want.
No.
And that we claim to believe that we know why we do things. In reality, what we've done is we've post-rationalized a plausible sounding explanation. And because it's both plausible and rational, we believe that to be therefore sufficient and acceptable. And we stop looking for other, deeper, more complex explanations. And so, the example I feature in my book about this is toothpaste, which is if you were to ask a bunch of adults, why do you clean your teeth? They would parrot back a whole series of answers about dental hygiene, need to prevent cavities, gum health, strong enamel, I don't want any fillings, I don't want any toothache. Yet actually, deep down, the real reason people clean their teeth is vanity and fear of having bad breath. And every single behavioral cue bears out this theory. So, for example, when do you clean your teeth? First thing in the morning, yes. Would you clean your teeth before going on a date? Yes. Okay. Do you clean your teeth after lunch? No. Okay. Why, fascinatingly, if breath freshness isn't a large part of it, why is 98% of the world's toothpaste flavored with mint?
Absolutely.
There's nothing to prevent you having strawberry flavor, salted caramel flavor, balsamic vinegar flavor, whatever you want. You can have toothpaste in any of those flavors, but it's pretty much always mint.
So, Rory, what I'm really interested in, and you mentioned your book Alchemy, and I'll touch on that, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've read it and I've listened to it, and but one of the things that I'm kind of passionate about is, we do a lot of retirement planning, and for the podcast, Retirement Cafes, a lot of it is about making smart, hopefully intelligent decisions around money, and all the other stuff that goes on as you get older, So we know that so many people don't have a will. So many people don't have a power of attorney.
You've got it. Yeah.
So many people are not saving possibly enough for their retirement. Then they seem to underestimate how long they're going to live. There's a whole you know, this idea of seeing one's future self, even though we could see our grandparents and maybe our great grandparents kind of having this long life, we seem to struggle with it ourselves. What's your thoughts around that?
I mean, at a very simple level, one of the just important discoveries of behavioral science, and it sounds trivial and almost silly, but it's nonetheless true, is we seem to have as a species an inherent terror of paperwork, don't we?
Yeah.
Now, I've been arguing this is less relevant to retirees, but certainly relevant to those planning retirement. I've been arguing for ages that we should make it much, much easier for people to make ad hoc payments into their pensions. Now, just to give you an example, if I want to transfer money from my savings account to my deposit account, which is much, much less tax efficient than putting it in a pension, I can do that. In fact, I could do it now while I was talking to you. I won't do that because that would be rude, but I could do it in about 2 minutes. Okay. If I want, let's say I had a windfall of £5,000, okay, and I thought, well, okay, let's put £2,500 of that into my pension as an ad hoc top up. I'd have to go and get my wife. She'd have to go to a filing cabinet, find some paper, okay. I'd have to write a check. I don't even know where my checkbook is. I haven't written a check for about a year. I'd have to find my checkbook, write a letter, find an address, I think somewhere in Bristol, explain in the letter what I wanted to do, which is to pay this into pension number 107654291, okay? And then I'd have to send it off. Now, by the way, they wouldn't send me a receipt. They wouldn't send me a text saying, we got your money, we've added the tax rebate, so you've now got an extra £3,000 in your pension or whatever. No. I'd have to then wait until my next pension statement came 6 months later, check, remember that I paid this money in, and check that they'd credited it to me. Yeah. Now, no human being is going to do that. Okay.
To be honest, I think it is easier than that now. You can do it. I mean, I made a pension payment in the last few weeks, and my wife Kathy paid a payment in. Hers didn't arrive or got rejected somehow and came back to the bank, and mine got in. I don't quite understand how that happened, but that happened. But my big issue with it, what's lovely about it, is that you took the action, or you think, I've got 2,500, I will make a contribution. And I was chatting to someone.
What's interesting about that is, weirdly, because it's difficult, okay, the human brain, not only do we not do it because it's difficult, we also don't do it because we think, well, if it's difficult, it must be a weird thing to do. Because if this were a normal, same thing to do that lots of people did, they would have made it much easier. Yeah. And so we assume that because it involves a huge amount of paperwork, it must be an incredibly convoluted thing which is done only rarely. And as a result, we probably wouldn't even think of putting £2,500 into our pension at all. That's the weirdest thing. I've got a little windfall due to me. Logically, I should put it into my pension. Weirdly, until I had this conversation with you now, it never occurred to me that I might do this. Yeah. Just to give an example, I asked 200 people who worked in financial services. I said, if I gave you £500 in cash, and the deal was you could keep that money provided you paid £500 into your pension before you got home this evening, how many of you would know how to do it? And one person put up their hand, and they worked for Goldman Sachs. Right. Okay. Now, so what I'm saying is that the government does this bizarre thing. It spends $25 billion a year incentivizing contributions to your pension, and yet makes non-scheduled pension contributions. It allows those to be an act of extraordinary bureaucratic torture. Mm. And by the way, a parallel which Richard Thaler found was there was a simple form handed out to academics at the University of Chicago. Now, bear in mind, if you're an economist at the University of Chicago, you pretty much sit in the top 0.05% of the most economically rational people on the planet. And there was a form you had to fill in, which simply meant that a couple of $1,000s were added to your pension. And I think Thaler went around and found that the vast majority of people hadn't filled in this form after 6 months. Yeah. And so there's something there, by the way, which is it sounds very banal, but one of the big lessons of behavioral science is make it easy. And I think there's a double payoff to making it easy, which is by making something easy, you don't only make it easy, you normalize it. You go, well, if my mobile banking app has a top up your pension button, I've now created a social norm. If there's a button for this thing, this must be a comparatively non-weird thing to do. So I now feel comfortable doing it. Whereas, interestingly, it was very interesting that two of you tried to top up a pension and you had a 50% success rate. I mean, and so that's, I mean, there are, by the way, out of behavioral science, one other point I'd make about those people who are retired. The financial services industry spends an enormous amount of time helping people maximize their expected utility in the shape of wealth. Okay, because economics assumes that every single consumer is a rational optimizer with stable preferences, perfect information, and perfect trust. They assume in economics that all consumers are already spending their money perfectly. Yeah. So the only way to improve your retirement is to have more money. I think research into happiness and well-being, and just the acknowledgement that people don't make perfect decisions, people don't have perfect information, people have all sorts of kind of emotional and behavioral obstacles to courses of action which would make quite a lot of sense. One of the greatest ways I think you could be a pension advisor is not just to advise people how to have as much money as possible to spend, but to advise them on how to spend it.
Yeah.
Because I think certain things are much more happiness enhancing than others. One of the things I've campaigned for, writing in The Spectator, is having either an Amazon Alexa or a Google voice-activated speaker. Those devices, which you can buy for £25, £30, and if you've got an internet connection and you connect them to Wi-Fi, they'll play any radio station in the world for you. They'll tell you the time. They'll tell you the weather. They'll play any music you like. My father's got one. There's an old people's home, for that retirement home, where a friend of mine's mother lives, who also has one. It's an extraordinarily valuable device, particularly for retired people. Because, you know, if you don't want to be sitting in front of a computer, but you just want little bits of information, anything from bus times to anything else, it can be really, really great. And it's kind of compatible in a funny kind of way.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that's occurred to me is that virtually nobody over the age of 60 is going to walk into a branch of Currys and go, what have you got in the way of the latest voice-activated cloud technology? Because the tech industry is obsessively pitching itself at the young and the trendy. And there's a sort of reason you do that, which is having young user imagery in marketing. I mean, if you take small new cars, okay, any ad for a small new car will always show a 29-year-old woman driving it. The vast majority of those cars are actually bought by people in their 60s and 70s, from new. Not necessarily second-hand, but the vast majority of people buying those cars from new are probably nearing or at retirement. Now, the reason you don't show a 65-year-old in the car is if you show a 65-year-old in the car, if you show a 29-year-old, you'll still sell a lot of cars to 69-year-olds. If you show a 69-year-old, nobody under the age of 40 will buy the car. Right. So there's a reason why the user imagery and advertising tends very, very young. But actually, in terms of advising people on how to spend their money, I think there are a whole range of interesting tech products out there, which would be massively happiness enhancing. But of course, they're never promoted to the audience who would benefit most.
No, absolutely. So what is, you know, you gave your age away a little bit about the 1988 when you started work at Ogilvy as a graduate, etc. So I know that we're of a similar age. What does retirement look like for you? What is your perspective there? I'm not suggesting that you want to tell on the national podcast.
No, I'm perfectly happy to discuss it, actually.
So what does it look like for you?
Well, a few things. One, it's fair to say that until I hit about 50, I didn't really give it very much thought at all, because it's in exactly the same way they found that anti-smoking health messages were pretty ineffective to 19-year-olds. Because when you're 19, the idea of being 58 is essentially, it's a parallel universe. It's not, when you're 50, people who get into their late 30s start getting worried about those things, okay? But when you're 19, actually discouraging smoking on health grounds is remarkably unsuccessful, because it's requiring people to have a level of foresight they don't, for evolutionary reasons probably, they just don't possess. And in the same way, I must admit, writing copy as an advertising copywriter for retirement plans in your 20s is, it requires quite a lot of method acting skills to get yourself into the mindset of the target audience, because you go, if I had £100 a month to spare, I'll just go for more curries. Why on earth would I give it away? And by the way, I think pensions are badly designed, incidentally. I think there should be an element of a pension which is retrievable. Because to say to someone in their 20s, when they know very little about what they may need over the next 10 years, they may be getting married, having children, buying a house, moving overseas, anything could happen when you're 23. But I'm 54, nothing's going to happen, other than health scares. Nothing that weird's going to happen. I'm not going to play for England or be discovered as a rock star. I basically know where I'm going. When you're 20, the possibilities are myriad. It will be much, much easier to sell pensions to the young if you said, and by the way, if you ever need 3,000 of this money, you can draw it down at no cost. Yeah. Because when you're young, cash flow rather than wealth is the dominant consideration. And therefore, committing to a pension which might destroy your cash flow, and therefore mean you don't go to the party, you don't meet the girl, all those possibilities get denied to you. I don't think humans are instinctively wrong at that age in being reluctant to commit money far in advance. Yeah. And I think the Canadians have designed something much cleverer, where there's a kind of hybrid ISA pension thing, where once you have a certain amount of money to draw on in the short term, then the money gets committed to the longer term, but only when you have a kind of buffer. Mm. But in terms of my own retirement, which I have to think of now at the age of 54, one thing would be, I would like it to be gradual, not immediate, if possible. Right. Now, one reason to be, I think, reasonably optimistic about new technology is that, what we're doing now, okay, I have no clue where you are, by the way. You could be in Barbados for all I know.
We're in Mudderford in Christchurch, so we're in the heart of the retirement community of the United Kingdom.
Now, I've heard there's a big problem with retired drunk driving around there. Is that true?
I haven't noticed it. No.
Someone was saying that retirees around there are starting to drink earlier and earlier in the day, and it's the police have this bizarre problem with. Anyway, I won't besmirch your community anymore. But very interesting, very good place to be, by the way, for the purposes of what you do.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is that. I don't want to be doing no work at all when I'm 60 or 65 or 68. I don't want to be doing nothing. Equally, nor do I want to be getting up at 7 o'clock every morning and travelling by train into London. And not that I do that at the moment, to be honest. And things like video conferencing, which make, I think, allow you to enjoy a degree of flexibility of place while still being able to contribute your accumulated knowledge. And that business, by the way, when you think about it, it's very strange. We accept people retiring. When people retire from a company, they take a lifetime's accumulated knowledge, contacts, experience, instinct. They take it and they walk straight out of the door. Now, there has to be a compromise where you say, look, okay, we're not going to demand you come in every day. You won't have necessarily a position of power, but we would still like to draw on your experience and your knowledge and your contacts to some degree. The Finnish Railways do that. So apparently if you retire from the Finnish Railways, they pay you a retainer to answer questions online.
Wow.
And so what will happen, I'm obviously making up the example, but let's say you're an engineer on Finnish Railways, and then, 6 months after you retire, there's a points failure at Slotty Bot Fast during a period of very cold weather. And what they'll do is they'll get in touch with you. They're paying you a few €100 a month. They'll get in touch. You go, oh, when that happens, it always happens when it's really cold. You go along and bang it with a large mallet, whatever the solution may be, and that fixes it. And because what they realized is that every time someone retired, they had to learn a whole load of things all de novo from scratch. And they realized that if we just pay people, a fraction of what their previous salary was, we can still at least draw on their experience. And of course, that retired Finnish railway engineer could be in the Caribbean if he wanted to be, because the whole thing happened online. He wasn't constrained to remain living in Helsinki or whatever it may be. And so that freedom of place thing really excites me about new technology, because I just like to work reasonably flexible hours with the autonomy to travel a little bit more, or the autonomy to go and live by the sea, or spend a lot of time. I've got a little flat in Deal, which I suppose is one of my little retirement plans. It's just a little maisonette. But the freedom of movement and freedom over where you are at a given time doesn't necessarily require that you give up work anymore.
No. And do you imagine, what else do you imagine doing with your time? I mean, if you're working less, what will you fill that time with?
One thing is, as a slightly nerdy person, my need for inordinate amounts of money on retirement may not be there in a strange way. Now, I think there are a large number of expenses that we engage in, partly as a reward for working. I always notice that we buy stupid things at airports. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
And partly I've been on this grueling business trip, bloody hell, it's been 3 days, I've been away from home. I deserve a treat. And I end up buying a shirt, or in one case, a weather station that I didn't really need, want, nor did I really understand why I'd bought it when I got home. I think there is a certain amount of money we spend while we work very hard, which comes under the L'Oreal category of because I'm worth it. And we do it as a form of self-validation. Now, when you retire, I suspect that quite a lot of my expenditure will drop fairly dramatically. I'm always interested to ask myself, what are the things that I wouldn't give up? First-class rail travel would be something, really good internet access and really good IT and entertainment, consumer electronics, which fortunately are pretty cheap, compared to cruise holidays, compared to cars, those goodies, which are very, very rewarding if you have a lot of spare time, because they're an extraordinarily expensive. I mean, friends of mine who are retired, Netflix is, when you think about it, a bit of a godsend, isn't it? In fact, I always think the prime beneficiaries of technology are probably retired people, because they've got the real time to appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
Well, other things, I've got a long time plan to get back into computer gaming. Now, this is the weirdest thing, okay? I used to love computer games when I was in my 20s and my teens. Really, really loved them. This was Sinclair Spectrum stuff. Okay, yeah. This was the very, very early days.
FedEx-81.
Oh, marvelous! Do you remember Ant Attack on the Sinclair Spectrum? Fantastic. Anyway,
64 as well. I'm really showing my age now.
The Commodore 64 had the Ant Attack, did it? Yeah, fabulous. Okay. Now you loved that stuff. Now, interestingly, one of the things I plan to do. Luckily, I've got an 18-year-old daughter who's into it, and she's providing me with coaching, effectively, on Red Dead Redemption 2 and God of War at the moment. And I'm still not very good, because I'm 30 years out of practice, because the moment you actually get a full-time demanding job and you get married and you have children, my wife would have generally frowned on it. I think it's in the early days of my marriage. I just spent the whole time staring at a screen. But it's something going to be that in retirement, I'd really like to get back into this.
Right.
Because the progress made in games is spectacular. And interestingly, I've got a colleague at work whose dad, at the age of 60, has done exactly that.
Right.
And he said it's a bit depressing, because he said, I ring my dad from the office And he cuts the call short. He goes, I'm terribly sorry, I've got to go now because a group of us are getting together to play at 9. And he means playing an online game, some sort of sandbox shoot-em-up thing. And occasionally, he'll go and visit his parents. Okay, now, normally what would happen is my father would complain that the young are obsessed with their new technology and they're not talking to us properly. His dad, in his 60s, goes upstairs and he just hears shouts from upstairs of they're attacking from the left.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I don't think many of your readers have actually got into computer games. Now, bear in mind, there are far more sedate ones for people who don't want that kind of white-knuckle action. I mean, there are train simulators, truck simulators.
There's a local, at Bournemouth University, we interviewed, they've got a research department there for dementia. And they ran some outreach programs, Dr. Ben Hicks, I think it was, where they would put the simulators in for driving and playing golf for people suffering from dementia. So they could still do these things, so they could enjoy a round of golf, they could enjoy driving a car again, they could, you know, in essence, in virtual reality, because of course they couldn't do it in out on the road, I suppose, or on the golf course any longer.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic, and also I think those things probably help keep you mentally alert. I mean, the research on this is slightly conflicting, but it does look as if doing crosswords, puzzles, and things is fairly good for your mental health. And I imagine gaming could be similar. But that's one of my little plans for retirement, is to get back into something which my work life effectively killed, because the investment in time in order to be tolerably good is pretty high, to be honest.
Yeah.
So tech, I look forward to enormously in my retirement, because one of the great things, one of my grandmothers was, you know, endlessly curious, and her retirement, in a sense, particularly when she became physically less capable, was much less curtailed than my other grandmother, who was much more outdoorsy and much more physically active, because my father's mother still did the Times crossword into her late 80s every day. And so being a person, it's a minority of people, to be honest, who are inherently curious. But being someone who is inherently curious, I mean, undoubtedly the online world is a gift, because in terms of cost per entertainment hour, you know, it provides you with an extraordinary amount of sort of emotional and mental stimulus at really what is a trivial cost per hour spent.
Yeah.
I look forward to, I think I look forward to just spending more time by the sea. I have no idea why it is that people retire to the sea, but a lot of people seem to have that urge, which is fascinating.
Yes. Now, Rory, can I touch on something that you've?
Of course.
A number of your TED talks and the book, especially Behavioural Alchemy. You've obviously had a career of, in essence, marketing goods and products and services, and there's a flip side also of you seem to spot on a number of occasions that I've listened to you or read your work, of things that kind of government are doing, policies are doing, and you think, and you've got an angle on it, and I feel that there's something there that you have this opportunity to give to government of, you know, there's a better way of looking at some of the stuff the NHS are doing, or an accident and emergency, or there's a better way of, you know, do we really need to be moving people on the HS2 faster from Birmingham to Manchester? There's just a different perspective.
Yes, I think what happens is it's very simple, which is in the private sector, because you have competition, the need to compete with incumbent players forces challengers to differentiate themselves. And they have to try a different play. And in that process, you discover sometimes what people really care about. And what people really care about isn't what logical people think they should care about. So if you're designing a railway, in fact, the entire economic justification for infrastructure expenditure in the UK is time saving. Okay? So I'll just wait for that hideous noise to finish. Sorry about that. So if you produced, for example, now the Eurostar, my argument is, particularly with new technology, where you can actually work on trains, you can read on trains, you can watch films on trains, okay? The obsession with speed is misplaced.
Mm.
Because the quality of the journey is probably more important in many respects than the duration. Okay, you know, and by the way, I think our railways are being designed very badly for our elderly.
Right.
You know, there's very great provision to people who are actually defined as disabled, and that if you're in a wheelchair, you'll be treated very, very well by the railways, and there will be an elevator, and there'll be someone to help you on the train. If you're merely slightly elderly, now you can help the things along by travelling in the middle of the day where it's quietest and so forth. But nonetheless, for example, the provision of platform seating, the provision of toilets. Now, typically people have a period of about 10 years at the end of their life when they don't drive. It'll vary. Some people it's 20, some people it's 0. But there's a kind of average period of 10 years where people don't drive at the end of their lives. And so the railways have a particular duty to look after those people, even though those people may not be disabled. They may just need, you know, rather more regular access to toilets, rather more toilets on the train. In other words, a toilet on the train where you don't have to walk through 4 carriages. Did you realise, by the way, that the Elizabeth line, Crossrail in London, the trains don't have toilets on them? Now, you could be going from Shenfield to Heathrow on a journey of about 2 hours, and there's no toilet provision. Probably okay if you're 19, but, you know, I'm 54. That slightly unnerves me, to be absolutely honest. And so that's, you know, so what we focus on, they always focus on, this is where it comes from, okay? You're an engineer, you know, if your background is physics, engineering, the metrics you use to improve something are all SI units. They're scientific units of weight, speed, you know, time, temperature, okay? Those metrics, so what you try and do is you improve your product using those scientific objective metrics. How those translate to consumer happiness is incredibly messy, non-linear, and non-exact. Right. So an example would be, there's far too much focus, I think, on cramming extra seats into trains. So as a result, the seats become basically, you have those horrible things where the backs are like ironing boards and they're not very comfortable. And, you know, everybody goes, oh, what a great victory. Well, no, it's not a victory, it's a defeat. You know, you've made traveling by train worse than traveling by car. Why would you do that? Okay. And so the obsession with being objective in order to be logical forces people to measure success by things which, ironically, human beings don't care about. Now, I'll give you a lovely example of this, which is queuing, okay? Now, a logical person trying to make queuing less frustrating would say, we need to make queues shorter. The only problem with making queues shorter is it's quite expensive to do that. In fact, here's a really interesting thing. What affects your level of annoyance in a queue? By and large, a shorter queue is better than a longer one. Don't dispute that, okay? But there are 5 or 6 other psychological factors which make a huge difference. If the end of the queue is out of sight, it's much more frustrating than if you can see it. If your queue keeps moving, it's much less frustrating than if your queue grinds to a halt. Part of our irritation with queues is oddly created by the people behind you in the queue. Kind of weird. But then if you really want to make someone miserable in a queue, have another queue alongside their queue, which is moving faster than theirs is. Or they'll give you something to read in the queue to keep yourself occupied. Yeah. A more interesting question might be, particularly for retired people, is why do you make people queue at all? Okay, why don't you adopt the cheese counter system? I would argue that, you know, going to an airport. I've just been working a little bit with Dublin Airport. Very good airport. They understand design very well. But one of the questions is, you know, should you make people in their 60s stand in a queue at all? Why don't you just say, take a number, go and sit down at that coffee shop, and we'll basically beep you, when you need to come back.
Yeah.
That would apply to NHS waiting times. There will be a large number of people where, to be honest, what you should do is you should get them seen by a triage nurse. You should say, okay, we won't be able to see you for 3 hours, rather than making you wait around in an NHS waiting room, sitting next to a frustrated methadone addict for 3 hours. Why don't you let people go home and come back? Because the nature of the time, the qualitative question, is arguably more important than the quantitative question. By the way, my cousin was for many years a consultant in A&E, and he said there's a very strange thing in waiting at A&E waiting times. If you see people and then you say you have to wait for 3 hours and you show them through to a different waiting room, they're in fact quite happy. If you send them back to the original waiting room, they feel insulted and get really upset.
Right. Must be some kind of feeling of progress, I suppose.
Well, I think that's interestingly. I once had to get an emergency passport at Victoria from and I was expecting it to be whoever's designed the emergency passport system at Victoria, where you quite often take a number, you go and sit and wait, and you keep moving through the system with about 5 or 6 consecutive parts of the process. And oddly, although the whole thing from beginning to end, including, by the way, going to a restaurant, having a meal while we were waiting for them to make our children's passports. Although the whole thing beginning to end is several hours, at no point did I experience even mild irritation.
No.
And that's better psychology, really. It's not better metrics.
No. So what are the big things, if you had the magic wand, that you could, suggest to government and they would actually take action on? What would you, if you were king for the day, King Rory, what would you do?
One of them has already been enacted, which is, of course, the opt-out default enrolment pension.
Absolutely.
Has been extraordinarily successful. In fact, vastly more successful than they expected. I think there's a reason for that, by the way, which is we feel safe having the same pension as all our colleagues.
Yeah.
And I think there's a really important reason for that, which is that if my own pension provider starts beefing up the charges or ripping me off, I'm probably not going to notice. If 100 of my colleagues have the same pension, some sad bugger in the finance department probably will notice, and he'll alert the rest of us.
Yeah.
And that comes down to, by the way, herding behavior. The reason antelope graze together is that you don't have to spend 50% of your time looking out for lions, because if there is a lion, the chances are you'll tell from the behavior of another antelope, rather than from the actual spotting of a lion.
No, I wonder whether the danger of everyone...
So there's really interesting cases where understanding evolutionary psychology could help us design better products or better ways to sell them. Other things I'd do is I'd experiment with the tax system. And the final thing I'd do, by the way, is I'd offer people a degree of choice. The assumption in the public sector is that you have to design for the average. And what you do is you try to provide something that's optimal on average. And there's a kind of belief that public services should be egalitarian. And one of the questions I repeatedly ask is, actually, why don't you give people a choice of 3 different things they can do and get them to choose one of them, rather than trying to impose behaviors on people according to something that's been designed for the idea of the single representative economic agent, which populates economic models, but which doesn't really exist in reality. So, one thing that's never been debated is there should be a choice of BBC license fee. Okay? I'm not sure you should decriminalize it. I'm not sure you should get rid of it. I think that there are certain areas where, because the UK speaks English, it's vital that we spend a certain amount of money on homegrown content. Because otherwise the risk is we end up with 95% American content. Now, that's not to say the American content isn't great, but we do need to see ourselves on TV from time to time. The BBC has a role in, national events. It has a role in news. It has an important role in radio, arguably. But it does strike me as ridiculous that there is, well, at the very least, why don't you have a BBC Plus license fee, which gives you access to far more archive material, for instance?
Yeah.
Why don't they let you, I would happily pay £20 a year extra to the BBC if they had a system on BBC iPlayer like Netflix, which meant that while you're on holiday, you could still watch the BBC, okay? I'm not suggesting expats can. I'm merely suggesting that if you go away for under 2 weeks, for the 2 weeks you're out of the country, you should still be able to watch it. Mm. So the fact that you try and design for everybody often means that government ends up satisfying nobody.
Yeah.
Or you satisfy everybody but please nobody.
Mm. And what would you do to the tax system, just touching on that?
I don't know enough about it, because obviously, I mean, emotionally, I don't think it works. I think there's something about the universal basic income which is interesting as an idea. I don't think it works. I mean, to be absolutely honest, I genuinely don't think you make that work, where you get rid of most welfare. One thing I'd look at doing is paying some welfare in lump sums rather than a constant drip.
Right.
Because a lump sum, contrary to what economists think, a lump sum gives you much more freedom than a constant drip salary does. Mm. Yeah. The best thing you might want to do is to move house or repair your car or whatever it may be, okay? And I think giving people constant small amounts of money, I think it's an economic misunderstanding to believe you can equate one lump sum with a constant stream of money, because the lump sum enables you to do immediately highly significant things. And there are experiments with, by the way, an altruism in the effective altruism movement with Give Directly, where the best way to improve the wealth of someone, in a poor person in a poor country, is to give them a big chunk of money up front and let them choose what they do with it.
Yes. And this brings me kind of full circle. I remember as a boy, and I'm sure you do, we used to get through the direct mail, through the letterbox, the Reader's Digest. If you could win £10,000 or £100 a week type of thing, and I remember as a boy sitting there trying to work it out. Maybe it's if I don't know what I've ended up doing that I'd have understood, but I used to sit there for ages going, well, if I live to 72, I think I'll take the income.
I also think, by the way, the tax system is wrong in quite a few ways, in that it makes no allowance for your having children, for example.
No.
Okay, it makes no allowance for your stage of life. Now, I would argue that actually you should give sort of tax breaks to people in the first 5 or 10 years of their earning life, on the grounds that at that stage you have a lot of expenses. You need to accumulate things. Okay, to an extent where, to be honest, if you gave me, I hate to say this, but if you gave me £10,000 and took me to a branch of curries, there's nothing there I actually need, okay? My father noticed this, that he actually said you become much less sort of materialistic and needy in retirement, partly, of course, because all the things you really need, you've already accumulated at some point.
Of course.
I think that the tax system, also, we shouldn't cut taxes, we should pay tax rebates. And the reason would be that when people get lump sums, there's much more freedom with what they do with them in terms of life-changing behaviour. But also tax cuts just get forgotten anyway. 2 years after a tax cut, it's not like you are ever comparing it with what you used to pay. You simply get into hedonic adaptation, and you regard that as the new normal.
Sure.
So the rebates will be interesting, because that would be a much more beneficial way to reward people as well, with one-off large payments. I think with tax, I think the money spent on encouraging pension saving is incredibly inefficient. I think that money could be used much, much better. I'd also argue it's a bit debatable, by the way, because now you've put the tax threshold for income tax up to £10,000. The old argument used to be, well, if you didn't give people a tax rebate when they contributed to their pension, they'd end up paying twice, once when they put it in and once when they took it out. Now, of course, people who are receiving a smaller pension are contributing less and less when they take it out now. An interesting one would be, I think retired people stay in their existing large housing for too long, probably. I mean, I always wonder whether it's welfare enhancing or not. My father was forced by circumstances to move to a much smaller property when he was about 70, and is really grateful that it happened, because it was so much easier to look after and so much more compact and so forth. But other issues with tax, it's interesting. We automatically assume that someone who earns £150,000 a year for 10 years running should be taxed in each of those years at the same rate as someone who earns £100,000 a year for 1 year of their life. Now, is that fair? Okay, you know, if you're someone like a school teacher, it may be only the last 4 years of your working life you get into the upper tax bracket. Now, is it fair then that at the very top, you suddenly tax people at the same rate as someone who's been earning those kind of that amount of money since they were 30? You know, I simply ask the question that what's interesting is that the tax system is designed by economists to a very large extent. And we need anthropologists in to say what is fair, you know, because interestingly, if you took Jeremy Corbyn's plans to put the tax rate up to the 5% of the population earning £80,000 a year or above, okay, well, yes, at any given moment, that chunk of the population is 5% of the population. If you include people married to someone earning £80,000 a year, of course, it may be 10% of the population. Then you add in people who hope to earn £80,000 a year, e.g. a trainee anaesthetist, right? Now you're talking 20% of the population. Because, you know, a lot of people do jobs and the reward for their job chiefly comes materially towards the end of their working life. You know, if you're a trainee barrister, you're actually technically poor. You're probably heavily indebted. Now, no one thinks of a trainee barrister as poor because 9 times out of 10, they'll be well rewarded in another 10 years' time. But the whole way we don't look at tax in a lifetime way. We look at it 1 year at a time.
I saw a survey yesterday saying the most hated tax in the United Kingdom is inheritance tax.
Which, interestingly, Adam Smith supported inheritance tax. I'd also argue, by the way, that you don't want your kids to inherit too much money too soon. And I mean that sincerely, in that the pride you can take in your own achievements. Let's say you were working in London, okay, and your parents had somehow left you, you know, a £700,000 house in London. You're in the awkward position now where almost nothing you do in work for your first 10 years can make as much difference to your well-being as having that house. And so, I mean, the weird thing about inheritance tax is an interesting one, because it, again, what behavioural scientists would say, it was often framed as a death tax. Now, actually, if you paid tax as the recipient, if you called it a windfall tax, and it included lottery wins, you know, capital gains on, capital gains on properties that weren't your principal residence, etc., etc. I mean, there's an interesting question about why, by the way, you exclude the principal residence from capital gain. Because that means that someone, you know, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was rather suspiciously, you could make the point that he was taxing capital gains on selling a buy-to-let home or a second home would be taxed at 50%, whereas capital gains on his house would be taxed at 0%. I think he bought his house for about £80,000 and it's now worth 900,000. Well, nice, Jeremy. Well done. You know, it's also, you know, that's also ridiculous because there are a huge proportion of Londoners who've just enjoyed this insane windfall. Now, the interesting thing about that is you'd obviously have a threshold for the windfall tax. Now, I would argue if you've got £1 million to leave, it's much better to leave 5 people £200,000 than it is to leave one person £1 million in many ways.
Mm.
So a tax system that encouraged that. Now, the problem is it's difficult to avoid, there are all manner of ways you could evade that by effectively paying people to, take an inheritance and then pass it back on to the, this is one of the problems which undoubtedly arises. But the inheritance tax, I mean, Adam Smith himself, the father of economics, broadly speaking, supported it because he said it doesn't diminish incentives.
No.
Unless, of course, you argue that a large part of the incentive for people working in later life is to provide for their children. This is where it gets complicated.
Yes. And the classic argument I hear is that, well, to gather this wealth, of course, I've already paid tax in the first place.
Yeah, which in the case of untaxed capital gains on your principal property isn't true.
No, it isn't. And of course, that's where the majority of wealth has come from.
Yeah, so you have this slight problem, which is that there are some interesting things they do in Denmark. It's worth having a look at the Danish approach to retirement. I know they have a system where you pay property taxes, and on retirement, you have a choice. You can either continue to pay the property tax or you can roll it up into an inheritance tax.
Right.
So they get, again, this is a case of choice. Okay. One interesting thing would be in terms of the whole care crisis. I think it would be quite interesting. One of the things we discussed is one very interesting way to get people to pay for insurance against needing care in later life is simply to add an extra year onto the end of your mortgage.
Right.
So you continue paying your mortgage for 1 year extra, and then that buys you, let's say, £700,000 of worth of insurance in the event that you need care at home.
Right.
There are interesting. The other interesting way to frame, of course, the care question is: what if the government simply said, if you commit 10% of the value of your home as effective inheritance tax, we will insure your care costs. Now, what you're saying to the inheritors is, you can either have a definite 90%, or you can have a chance of 100% and take the risk of naught. Okay.
Yeah.
So a voluntary inheritance tax, which would pay for certain things in later life, would be a really interesting thing to explore.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, Rory, I mean, I could chat to you for hours, to be honest, and you've got such a view on so many different topics. I've really thoroughly enjoyed listening to your perspective.
I'll end up with consumption tips. In other words, I've already recommended, if you're retired, that the tech world get a grandchild or a tech savvy neighbor if you're not tech savvy yourself. Just to say, okay, I want to spend a few £100 on. It might be games, it might be voice activated devices, but the benefits are rather huge. They're just never promoted to you. There are other bits of gadgetry. The Philips air fryer is one of the devices I argue is. I don't know if you got one.
When we chatted the other, I then went out and bought one, and we're loving it.
You're loving it. You see, now that's a device which again has never been marketed effectively, but it's a game changer. If you live alone, or if they're just two of you, and you want to cook quickly for a smaller group, smaller group of people, the Philips air fryer is an absolute godsend. I'm glad you like it as much as I do. Yeah. So that's one interesting area I'd love to get into, which is retirement advice, which is not about investment, it's about spending.
Yeah. So air fryer. What else? Anything else?
A Japanese toilet, undoubtedly, if you can afford it. The Japanese shower toilet, which washes your own bum. I finally, after large amounts of wrangling with my wife when we got the bathroom redone, it's 10 times more better than I ever imagined.
Fantastic.
I think this is the Geberit Aqua Wash, if you want the specific brand name. But I mean, it's a really interesting question about where, there ought to be research into the happiness of retirees, depending on whether they don't work or work a bit, where they live, what kind of community they live in, how they spend their money, I think would be a really, really interesting question to research, because you can not only get a return by having more money, you can get just as great a return by spending your money more shrewdly.
Yes. And we've interviewed lots of guests, and we specialize here in helping people who possibly are looking for that. Retirement can be 30 years. And therefore, we asked the question, so if you were, 90, sitting in your rocking chair, looking back at those 30-year time horizon, what would have had happened for you to feel really fulfilled, really, proud of those 30 years? What's happened in that life? If you're talking to your grandchild and they're saying, Rory, Grandpa Rory, tell me about your retirement. What did you do? Who were you? You've told me all about your career. I get that, but what did you do when you suddenly had all this extra time? What made you get up in the morning and be find fulfillment?
That's exactly the right question to ask, because too much of the focus is on wealth optimization. I think we also have to accept the fact that more and more working life will taper down.
Yeah.
My father, funnily enough, got into selling secondhand books on Amazon,
right,
which is something you can fairly easily do from home. And he found that incredibly rewarding and enjoyable.
Mm.
It's partly that he had a very large book collection himself, and he suddenly realized, well, the reason I used to hoard these books is because 20 years ago, before the internet, it might take me a year to find a replacement for any of them. Whereas, to be honest, now I can find a replacement for any of them in 48 hours. So he started selling off the more valuable books on the grounds that, if he ever changed his mind, he could just buy them back again, effectively.
Right.
But he also then ended up doing it for a whole bunch of friends and for a few deceased people's estates and so forth, and found that immensely enjoyable.
Yeah.
And so, that's an interesting question, which is one of the things I think needs to be done much more, is designing work for retirees. And all that's required, if you think about it, okay, most work nowadays isn't physically grueling. Some work is, but most of it isn't. Most people are mentally and reasonably physically capable long into retirement. They're designing jobs that can be done anywhere. The one thing I realized is that there's free time and there's also free place.
Right.
And one of the interesting things, one of the reasons I nearly always agree to a podcast is because if I say, okay, well, I'll record a podcast, okay. I'm actually at home today because I often work from home on Fridays.
Mm.
Now, the podcast, I might have gone to Deal today to spend the weekend at the seaside. I've got a broadband in Deal. I could have done the same thing there. It doesn't constrain me to being in a particular place. It's just an hour of my time. That's fine, okay. The thing that's a pain in the ass about work is not really the time, it's that it forces you to live in an expensive place and to travel to an expensive place every bloody day with monotonous regularity.
Yeah.
And I mean, interestingly, we were talking about this, saying 99.9% of the world's population, okay, if you said, I'll pay you £500 for an hour of your time on video conference, would say yes. Okay, I do quite a lot of public speaking. I talk to other public speakers. They say, what you're charging for isn't really the talk. What you're charging for is all the pain in the ass stuff either side, getting up in the morning, flying to Frankfurt, finding a hotel, checking in. If you strip away all that stuff, the ability to be incredibly mentally productive with the minimum of wasted effort is really spectacular. And so video conferencing, along with the Philips air fryer and the Japanese shower toilet, is the most underused technology in terms of its ultimate potential. And particularly for people either nearing retirement or shortly after retirement. The facility to make yourself useful through video, if you strip away the need to make really tedious long journeys, you know, and the opportunity to tap into wisdom through that seems to be amazing.
Yeah, you're right. We're doing more and more. We've got clients all over the country, and more have been done. I've never actually met them. You know, I mean, we've obviously met.
No, absolutely right. Yeah,
like we are today, but you can do everything with sharing your screen, sharing the paperwork. You know, it's so accessible. I must come to a close, Rory, because as I say, it's been really fascinating chatting to you, and I really appreciate your time today. So to find out more about Rory, his books and the work that he does, check out the show notes on the website retirementcafe.co.uk, where we'll put links to everything we've discussed today. And I'm sure I can even find a link to that Japanese toilet, the Philips air fryer, and obviously Rory. Rory, where can people find out more about you?
If you're a Twitter user, at Rory Sutherland, all one word, is probably the best way in which to keep in touch. I rather like Twitter because it's a form of serendipitous communication which doesn't really involve obligation. You know, an email is something you're obliged to respond to. Twitter, you know, is glorious partly because you can ignore it for 5 days if you feel like it.
Absolutely. So, also, I'd like to thank everyone who's reviewed the podcast. We've had some really lovely reviews recently, so please do that if you can. It helps more people like you to find us. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to let me know your thoughts, head to iTunes and click on the ratings and reviews. To find out who's coming up next on the podcast, head over to the retirementcafe.co.uk upcoming, where you can also subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Once again, thank you, Rory. Really appreciate your time. It's been absolutely fascinating chatting.
It's a huge pleasure. Yours is also a really worthwhile idea too. So, I mean, full plaudits for that.
Thank you, Rory. All the best.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much indeed.
So until next time, this is Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.